All right, in Activity 3, we're going to start using all of the different tools that we've learned when it comes to calculating sides and angles in triangles to calculate unknown sides and angles in various different types of triangles. This flowchart is going to help you decide which tool to use. If we start up at the top, the first question you should ask yourself is, what type of triangle are we looking at? If it's a right angle triangle, you're going to go down this path. And if it's an oblique triangle, then you're going to go down this path. If it's a right angle triangle, we're probably going to focus in on primary trig ratios. If we're looking for an angle, then we're going to use our inverse functions. If we're looking for a side, there's one other question we have to ask ourselves. How many other sides do we know in that right angle triangle? If it's only one, then we're going to focus in on our primary trig ratios. But if we know two of the sides in a right angle triangle, we can use the Pythagorean theorem. Now, if it wasn't a right angle triangle, then we have to determine whether or not we're going to use the sine law or the cosine law. Well, to decide that, we know to use the sine law, we need to know an angle and the length of the opposite side. So if we do know an angle and the length of the opposite side plus one other piece of information, then we're going to use the sine law. If we don't know an angle and the opposite side, then that means we have to use the cosine law. Let's take a look at the sine law. If we're asked to find a side length, then we're going to use the sine law in this form. And if we're asked to find an angle, then we'll use the sine law written this way. Looking at the cosine law, if we're asked to find a side, then that means we need to know one angle and the two sides that enclose that angle. And we can use the cosine law written this way. If we're asked to find an angle, then that means we must know all three sides, and we can use the cosine law written this way. So let's take a look at some of the triangles and determine which way we are going to solve for the unknown. Using our flowchart, we can take a look at this triangle, and right away we see that it is a right angle triangle. So that means we're off this way. So the next thing you need to ask yourself is, are we looking for a side or are we looking for an angle? Well, we're not looking for an angle, we're looking for a side length. Finally, are we given one side or are we given two sides? Well, in this triangle, we're only given one side, so that means that we have to focus in on our primary trig ratios. To solve this, we can now label this triangle with opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So opposite is over here, this is the adjacent side, and this is the hypotenuse. And now we know that we're going to have to use our cosine primary trig ratio. Let's take a look at the next question. All right, for this question, we can see that this triangle is not a right angle triangle, so we're not going down this path, we're going over here. Now, we have to determine whether or not we are going to use the sine law or the cosine law. Now remember, to use the sine law, we need to know an angle and the opposite side. In this diagram, we're given the angle, but we don't know the opposite side. We don't know anything about the other two angles, so we're not going to be able to use the sine law. The next thing we have to ask ourselves is, can we use the cosine law? Well, we're being asked to calculate a side length, which means that we're going to be focusing in on this formula, but we have to make sure we have enough information. Now, to calculate a side with the cosine law, we must know an angle and the length of the sides that enclose that angle, which we do have here. So that means that we can use the cosine law for this triangle here. If I label this diagram with A, B, and C, that makes this side A, this side over here is B, and this is C. It looks like we are asked for side A. So we're going to use the cosine law written this way. A squared is going to equal B squared plus C squared minus 2BC cosine of angle A. Now all we need to do is substitute in what we know and solve. For this next triangle, again, we don't have a right angle triangle, so we're not going down this path. We have to ask ourselves, do we have enough information to use the sine law? In the sine law, we need to know an angle and the opposite side. And we do have that information, so we're going to be using the sine law. Next, are we being asked for a side or an angle? Well, we're being asked to calculate theta, which is an angle, which means we're going to use this trig function. To get started, we have to label our triangle with A, B, and C, and it really doesn't matter which sides or angles are A, B, and C. Now I want to mark the sides on here as well too. So this is going to be side B, this is going to be side A, and this is going to be side C. So I do have information about angle B and side B, so I'm going to use that. And I'm calculating angle C with side C. So I'm going to write my sine law this way. Sine of angle B over B is going to equal sine of angle C over C. Finally, I'm going to plug in what I know and solve for angle C. Let's take a look at the next question. We have another question where we do not have a right angle triangle. So that means, again, we're not going down this path. We have to ask ourselves, do we have enough information to use the sine law? Well, to use the sine law, we need to know one angle and its opposite side. We don't know any angles here, so we're not going to be able to use the sine law. Now we need to check whether or not we can use the cosine law. For this question, we're asked for an angle, so we're going to be focusing in on this version of the cosine law. But to use the cosine law to calculate an angle, I must know all three sides. And in this triangle, I do have all three sides. I'm going to label my diagram with A, B, and C. So A, B, and C, making this side B, this side A, and this side C. So to calculate angle B, I'm going to use the cosine law this way. It's going to be cosine of angle B is going to equal A squared plus C squared minus B squared, all divided by 2AC. Plugging in what I know, I'll be able to calculate angle B. Good luck. Now, let's take a look at the next one. All right, in this question, we do have a right angle triangle, finally. So we're going to go down this path. Now we need to determine what are we being asked for. In this case, we're being asked for an angle. So that means we're going to be using our inverse primary trig ratios. Next step is to label our diagram with opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. So since this is the angle that we're focusing on, opposite is over here. Hypotenuse is always opposite the 90-degree angle, and this is adjacent. Because we're given information about the opposite and adjacent, we are going to be using tan of theta equals opposite over adjacent. Substituting in what we know, we'll be able to calculate theta. All right, in this last question, we are not given a right angle triangle, so that means we are not going down this path. We have to go down this path. We have to ask ourselves, do we have enough information to use the sine law? Well, to use the sine law, we need to know an angle and the opposite side. We do have that information, so we're going to be able to use the sine law. Are we going to be looking for a side or an angle? Well, we're looking for a side, so that means we're going to be using the sine law written this way. To solve for x, we should start off by labeling our triangle. And those are our angles, and these are our sides. In this case, we're asked for side B, but we need to know angle B to use the sine law. We're going to start off with our ratio of A over sine of angle A, because those are the two things that we're given. To calculate B, it's going to be B over sine of angle B, but we need to know what B is. Because we know that all three of those angles, A plus B plus C, must add up to 180 degrees, we can calculate angle B fairly easily. And then we can use our sine law to calculate B. Good luck!